In this lecture, we will be covering organizing, rehearsing, and memorizing study materials. Last week, in your note-taking lecture, you were introduced to the core learning system. The core learning system breaks down different ways that we learn and take in information through skills that we are applying. So in the previous weeks, we learned some reading strategies and note-taking strategies, which are part of the collecting of information. This week, we're talking about organizing study materials as well as memorizing them, which are part of organize and rehearse. And then the last part of the core learning system is evaluate, which we'll be going over in the next week when we talk about test-taking strategies. So again, the core learning system is something that helps us understand how we're using the skills and their purpose. So you're collecting, organizing, rehearsing, and evaluating the information that you are trying to learn. In these next couple slides, you're going to be introduced to different ways that you can organize and rehearse and memorize your study materials before, while, and after. So take into consideration these different steps or strategies that might work for you. When it comes to organizing study materials, you'll see here that a lot of this is related to your note-taking. So when you're organizing your study materials, you're gathering the information that you've already collected, and you're going to prepare yourself for the next portion, which is rehearsing and memorizing. Now, before we go into the different steps of rehearsing and memorizing, either before, while, or after, we are going to talk about two different types of rehearsal strategies. So the first type of rehearsal strategy that you can use is called elaborative rehearsal. Now, elaborative rehearsal uses deep processing and strengthens your understanding and your remembering of concepts. It focuses on the meaning and relationships between ideas, and this is where you can use your connection to prior learning with the new knowledge that you're taking in. So it's connecting new with the old. It tends to serve learning goals better for college students, especially when you are learning really complicated concepts and trying to make sure that you are not only learning but applying that information. The second type of strategy for memorization or rehearsing is rote rehearsal. And in rote rehearsal, this is where you focus more on remembering and heavily using repetition. So the good part of rote rehearsal is that you're able to memorize through repetition, and it can serve you well in the long term. So things will stick to you, like for example, memorizing your alphabet and your multiplication table. The bad part of rote rehearsal is it can sometimes involve mindless memorization, which doesn't necessarily help you understand concepts in a deeper way. And also when you're learning, you also want to know how to apply that information, practical learning. And rote rehearsal doesn't necessarily provide that. So an example of rote rehearsal could also be memorizing a math formula, then coming into the day of the test and not knowing how to use it. So again, learning through repetition could be great through a certain extent, but when you're asked to apply that information, the repetition doesn't necessarily give you that opportunity to use your practical learning. So elaborative rehearsal can be more beneficial when you're really trying to understand concepts and make a deeper connection. Rote is good to a certain extent, again, for memorization repetition. And you'll be able to kind of go back and forth between these two types of strategies as you take classes or learn new information in any aspect of your life. So we're going to move on here to the rehearsing and memorizing strategies. So just like the organizing slide a couple slides ago that we were going over, you'll see that this is broken down into before, while, and after. So it's important for you to look at the different phases of your studying, what you're doing to prepare, what you're doing during, and then after. So take some time to look at this slide and look at the different steps and strategies that you can try out. We're going to be going over some specific memory techniques in these next few slides. And these are very specific techniques that you can try. You can pick and choose some that are new to you and maybe some that might be more beneficial for certain types of classes. Some of these techniques you may be already familiar with and may have tried, which is great. But if there's anything new that you can pick up and try this semester, I highly encourage that you do so. So let's move into this first type of strategy, which is called using acronyms. So acronyms, I think we're all very familiar with a lot of these, and I listed some common ones here that we just use on a day-to-day basis. But basically, acronyms is using the first letter of a word to remember either a phrase, a sentence, or just any kind of concept that you're trying to remember. Now, our core learning system, CORE, is a form of an acronym for you to remember what it stands for. So remember, CORE stands for collect, organize, rehearse, and evaluate. So that's just one example of an acronym that we're using to remember information in this specific class. But again, you may be learning some different acronyms for other classes as well. Acrostics. So acrostics are also like acronyms, but in this case, it's used more for sentences rather than, specific words. And acrostics are just a little different in that when you're creating the acronym, you're actually creating it for a sentence. And one example that is pretty common for acrostics that you may have come across when you're learning the order of operations for math is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So again, many of us may have learned this in the past, but it's just one example that you may be familiar with. And I just wanted you to see how an acrostic does look. But it might be a fun way for you to learn other concepts. So definitely try it out, be creative, create some sentences that will stick with you. The next memorization strategy is creating associations. And this goes back to what we've been talking about, which is connecting to prior learning. So when you're able to associate something new with something that you already know, this tends to allow the information to stick with you and it becomes more easier to recall. Sometimes it can take a physiological form, which, when we're using our senses, for example, if there are fragrances, scents, or aromas that trigger a certain memory, that is a form of association as well. So again, creating associations can make more of a meaningful impact when you're trying to employ memorization skills. And in this next slide, we are going to be covering a specific type of association technique, which is called the loci technique. The loci, or the word loci, is plural for the word locus, which basically means location. And this technique involves the association of items to memorize with familiar places. So one example is maybe if you're creating a grocery or a shopping list and you're trying to memorize it, one way to do that is maybe using locations of your home to store that information. And on the right-hand side here, you'll see a diagram of the different steps that you can follow to build a memorization or a place for you to store that information through the loci technique. So first you want to have a place. You're building a memory place. So in this example of memorizing a grocery or shopping list, you can use your home as that place. And then you want to create a path. And in that path, you can do a mental walkthrough of each location in your house. From there, you want to assign certain items to an area or spot in that location in your house. And then also place those objects to remember where they're at. You can also draw this memory place out if that works better for you, especially if you're more of a visual learner. And this is also, the loci technique is a great way to memorize locations on your body. So it doesn't have to necessarily be just a home or a specific place. But for those of you who are pre-nursing students or going into the health field where you're going to be taking a lot of biology, anatomy, physiology, or microbiology classes, the loci technique might be an effective strategy for you to use, especially when you're trying to remember certain concepts or terms or anything that happens within the human body. So something fun to try out, especially if you're taking those science classes this semester. In this slide, there are additional techniques to try out. Some simple ones, such as rhyming, singing to the tune of maybe a familiar song, sometimes the melody of a song. If we replace the words with maybe concepts you're trying to learn, it can stick better. So that's another form of memorization that you might want to test out and see if it works for you. Assigning numbers, if you like numerics, you can use what's called the peg technique to assign numbers to certain items. But always consider what works best for you and your learning style. So again, we all learn in different ways, and you want to try out a technique that might first contribute to your way of learning or your preferred way. And that pretty much concludes this lecture for the week. I do want you to focus on the slides where you can see the strategies for organization, rehearsal, and memorizing before, while, and after. You're going to be referring to these strategies and these slides to answer your discussion post for this week. So make sure that you go back and review that information if needed. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions. Have a great week.